All right, great. Episode 42, 43, 42. I'll double check that, make sure that it's correct. Astute listeners will notice a slight delay in the publication of this episode. I am currently on the live stream, waving to my YouTube audience there. And I typically do the live stream sometime over the weekend, and then I extract the audio and publish it as the podcast, send that all out with a newsletter on Monday morning. It is now Monday evening, and so I'm behind schedule. And in fact, my episode notes for today are also a bit chaotic. I'm holding up to the camera. Those of you who are watching on the live stream will notice, look, I won't claim to have meticulous notes at any point, but they are particularly chaotic today. But I do have a few points I want to get to. Continuation of the discussion of the natural radio that we were talking about last week, and a couple of other things. To start with, I did get some follow-up. Last episode, or the one before, I think it was last episode, where I was talking about Thoreau and the lakes. And I was trying to draw a comparison with Heraclitus and the river. Heraclitus speaks about the river. You can never step into the same river twice. Thoreau was talking about this timeless element of the lake, and I was interested in the frisson between those two, and may still come back and talk about it some more. But at least twice, and I think 3 times in the episode, I said Herodotus instead of Heraclitus, for which I apologize. So, to start with, before we get to natural radio and sonic plenitude, which I think is what we're going to talk about, I'm going to bring up a quote from the Dalai Lama, which may, by the end, fit in to everything else that I'm talking, or it may not. But it struck me. It was one of the things that showed up in my feed a few days ago, and I'm going to assume that the attribution is correct. It was on a site that I have no reason to think makes stuff up. So attributed to the Dalai Lama, this conversation, a few sentences here that I'll read. And let's just say, even if it's not truly spoken by the Dalai Lama, I still think that the language, the words are interesting. So here it is. It starts off like this. My daily practice is preparation for death through meditation. Right, so this is the Dalai Lama speaking. My daily practice is preparation for death through meditation. Make separation between the body and consciousness. So, unless you reach the deepest subtle consciousness, you cannot separate this body and mind. So once you reach that deepest stage, then it can separate and then go deeper, 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 then deepest. That's clear light. So anyway, sometimes I joke, in 24 hours I experience 7 times death and rebirth. Then when actual death happens, then this practice becomes useful. So there's a lot in there. The idea of the separation of body and consciousness is an interesting starting point to begin with, and one that I'm sure we could have hours of discussion about. But let's take that as just set to the side and come back to it later, although it reminds me of Socrates and his apologia. Maybe make a note there for another discussion point. The idea of meditation as a process of deepening stillness to the point where you resolve into clear light, right? But then that process, the familiarity with that process being essentially the same process at the death moment, the moment of death. And the meditation is to become familiar with that experience or with that shift, so that when it happens for the last time, you're ready for it. It actually reminds me, in the musical Hamilton, I think there's a line, oh shit, I'm not going to remember it now. Thought so much about this moment so that it would feel like a memory. It's right at the end when he's dying. I have to dig it out. It struck me when it came up. Thought so hard about this moment. Now that it's happening, it's like a memory, something like that. Anyway, this idea that the daily practice of meditation, for all of the other realizations and benefits that accrue, central to it is the preparation for death. That meditation is this mortal process. So let's jump over from that. Jump over from that Dalai Lama quote and back to some of the points that were in this this book I've been reading called Earth Signals. Earth Signals, Earth Energy by Douglas Kahn. Last week I talked a little bit about the telegraph wires first receiving, or when people first heard the electromagnetism of the ionosphere through the wires and then amplified in the telephone, and what they wrote about and talked about, and how that almost immediately prompted an aesthetic discussion. The language that was used to describe these electromagnetic events was aesthetic. It was musical, and within a few decades, composers were either using directly these sounds in their compositions. Composers like Alvin Lucier incorporated electromagnetic signals directly, or the idea of sound that mirrored this new form being included. So Lucier attached electrodes to his head, or to an assistant's head, and had the brain waves transduced through physical mechanics to create sound. And I talked about transduction last time, but quickly to summarize, it's the change in energy state, either in the frequency within the same energy type, mechanical or electromagnetic, or shift between the two using some technology that will take electromagnetism and make it audible, for example. And that idea of transduction is very important in this book, and it's also important in my work and the ideas that I talk about when I talk about electromagnetic art, either with this moon piece and the Rotterdam transmission that happened last year, or my ongoing urban electromagnetic field recordings that I call the Bellaboke. But one of the ways that I've framed this for myself is this idea of sonicism, and it's essentially the same as this idea. It is transduction, but I put 3 bullet points that I'll read here. So this is sonicism, and I think at the time when I put this together, I was thinking I want a slogan, or I want a manifesto, the manifesto of sonicism, and maybe that's where this will go. But here's some ideas that have percolated throughout my musical compositional work for decades. Jeez, I can really say decades now. I'm an old man. An old man in a fez. As I stare down my live stream audience. So, sonicism. Now, this is me writing. Sonicism is a thought model, a subset of a broader complex of ideas that explore the essentially vibratory notion of reality. Point 1. A waveform in one medium holds meaning in a second. A waveform in one medium holds meaning in a second. Point 2. Sound represents the interstice of physiology and cosmology. Point 3. Experience is a standing wave, a habit of creation and its creatures. So then I wrote a bit more around that. The patterns of vibration in air that we call sound can be expressed using mathematic models. Particularly useful is the Fourier transform, which separates a waveform into constituent sinusoids. Each frequency represents a component, and when combined, the sinusoids sum to the original. Fourier transform is a tool that can be applied to any waveform, allowing for a common representation of structure across multiple media. So the idea that was really stuck in my mind then was if you created a waveform in sound and recreated that waveform in electromagnetism, changing over time, the meaning of the gesture held, and in fact was added to, because now you were presenting this gesture in an unhearable medium, right? In a medium that a human cannot instinctively or without the aid of technology cannot perceive. And so in order to apperceive that piece and consider it as an aesthetic object, you have to change the definition of yourself as a human, either by plugging in to a piece of technology or by recognizing that there is an aura around us where these objects do exist. What does it mean to imagine something? It isn't unreal. It's a different extension of our senses. To hear an electromagnetic piece means you have to redefine what hearing is, or seeing, or feeling, what the senses are. So it's very important, I think, or the idea that this process of transduction, at least what was getting me excited about it was the idea that you could create something that was beautiful or had meaning in a medium that was mysterious and magical and off kilter, not part of the initial sensorium. So I end the paragraph by saying the abiding presence, which I think I just meant the object, right? The object, whether it's now musical or electromagnetic. The abiding presence is transient, liminal, and aesthetic. So the abiding presence, it could also mean paying attention, and that's something that Douglas Kahn talks about as well, is that when you've expanded the definition of music to the point where anything is considered music, then attention is what makes it musical. And this was part of John Cage's thinking, as well as many of the other composers, but Douglas Kahn quotes Cage. This is John Cage talking about, this is a quote, the drive for sonic plenitude. The plenum is the all, right? The sonic plenitude is a much richer array of sound that can be considered musical or that is being paid attention to. And Kahn uses the example of Cage's piece 4 minutes and 33 seconds as a piece where Cage frames all sound as musical. Now, that's a slightly different take on the piece than I've had. 4 minutes 33 seconds is a piece for usually for pianist. I believe it could be played by any instrumentalist, but it's for the pianist. Opens up the lid of the piano, sits as if to play, and then for 4 minutes and 33 seconds makes no motion. And the audience is left then to hear all the other sounds. And what Khan is saying is that this opens up all the other background sounds, whatever they are, coughs and everything, as the sound that you're hearing when you would have expected to hear music. And since you're now attending as if you were listening to music, those sounds are musical. I had always, or I'd come to the consideration of 4 minutes and 33 seconds as a piece that was about a bedrock of silence, that it was shifting the canvas down a point so that you actually weren't paying attention to all of the sounds. You weren't paying attention to the music, the performance, because there was none. And so you also were not paying attention to the other sounds. What you were experiencing instead was the actual canvas upon which the sounds were being etched or placed, which maybe is the same thing, or maybe it's completely different, and maybe it's a misreading of the piece, or maybe it's a piece that can hold multiple readings. I actually gave a performance of 4 minutes and 33 seconds as an undergraduate in a undergrad aesthetics, philosophy of aesthetics class, and I lost my nerve after about 90 seconds and stopped, which was interesting that I would do that, but that's what I did. So the idea, this sonic plenitude and sonicism, the transduction of music into silence, in the case of 4 minutes 33 seconds, or into electromagnetism in the case of some of the pieces that I've thought about, and with Lucier, where the electromagnetism is actually the sound. And the other point that Khan raises that I thought was interesting was the shift between utterance and audition, where audition is the A-U-D-I-T-I-O-N, if I'm not saying it right, audition. Where the important part of the music is for it to be heard, as opposed to utterance, where the important part of the music is for it to have been stated and then paid attention to. So the idea of transducing electromagnetism into sound, of the utterance of that, it is the sort of the beheld, like the logos beheld, is an important distinction. So let's see. I'm looking at my notes now. They are a bit scattered. We talked about the Dalai Lama, and then we talked about transduction, sonicism. I'm not sure if I said the word interstice. I know interstitial is easier to say, but the singular point, I-N-T-E-R-S-T-I-C-E, the interstice of physiology. I could have just said the intersection, but the interstice. Sound represents the interstice of physiology and cosmology. So the idea that sound is this fulcrum point between experience and the experienced, where the experienced is this broad plenitude, this plenum, electromagnetic plenum, that extends even beyond the sonic plenitude that Cage is initially talking about, although I'm sure he was thinking broader in terms of received waves. He did write, what was it, the landscape for radio, and then something I think of variations. He wrote a number of pieces that were based on the, I think specifically detuned FM rate, right? That maybe the guide in the score is don't find a melody station, but find the static in between. So this idea of a much broader transduction of sound, think of the human body as an utterance, that we are trying to transduce into a plenitude of experience, or plenum of experience. And things like meditation practice that distill the experience down into that clear light, what the Dalai Lama was saying is the preparation for death. It's really a process of transduction. There's a formal similarity between the clear light meditation and the sonic plenitude of the utterance of electromagnetism. That might be as good a place as any to leave it, actually. Now that I put it that way, let's say that that's a sufficient bit briefer than normal. But again, if you could see the chaos in my studio here, I mean, behind the camera is absolute mayhem, cables and everything. And when I unplug this, I'm going to download it, get it up on both the podcast and on YouTube. Try and get the newsletter out tonight as well. All of those are things you should subscribe to, and the feedback I get is very, very valuable. I really appreciate when people ask me questions or challenge what I've said. I do occasionally say things that are nonsense, and I am delighted. I delight in being challenged when I have spoken nonsense. So feel free to use either the comments in the YouTube or send me an email, or a telephone call. If you send me a telephone call, I won't answer it, but I will know that you called. So next week, I'm going to continue with the natural radio piece, but what I'm planning on doing is pulling together a half dozen or so books that would form a library of sonicism, or my own library of this material. So the Douglas Kahn book would be there. I have some Stockhausen writings, a book by a called Jocelyn Godwin. It's a collection of mystical text on sound. Daphne Oram has a book on oramics, which is this weird circuitry-based idea of sound and human spirituality or physiology. I think it would be nice to put all of those together and then see what it looks like. Maybe it's a special library. Maybe it's a curriculum or a topic for a whole separate subject, or series, a whole separate series. Anyway, cheers. Those of you on live stream, thank you for watching, and everyone else, keep your wits about you, my friends.